There is nothing like thinking you know the Bible well or that you are familiar with Jesus' teachings, and then you look at the lectionary for the day you're supposed to preach that includes verses that you actually are familiar with, and you wonder, what exactly is Jesus talking about here anyway? These two short sections of verses that we read today, while familiar, especially those verses about Jesus bringing rest, end up feeling a lot different when they have to be explained. It's one of those sayings that sounds really nice when you see it in a pretty picture on Facebook. It says, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." So we see that and we think how great it is, because who hasn't felt weary or burdened? I know I have, especially in the last few months. And I love the idea of rest after a busy week or month or even year. But just as much as we'd like to take this verse and consider it to be just a nice, inspirational saying, there's a lot more going on than we realize. Because Jesus didn't just go around randomly making trite comments for us to share on social media 2,000 years later. So I looked into it a little bit more, especially because it didn't really seem to go along with the other verses that began the section about the children in the marketplace. What do they have to do with each other? We like to pull out that verse about rest for inspiration, but it actually is the culmination of the entire chapter. So let's go back to the beginning of chapter 11. Jesus had just instructed his disciples and was preaching and proclaiming the gospel, the good news, in the cities. And for some reason at this point, John the Baptist, who is sitting in jail, is questioning whether or not Jesus really is the Messiah he'd been waiting for and had been proclaiming. So he sends people to ask Jesus to clarify if he is the one who was expected. In typical Jesus fashion, he does not answer the question directly with a yes or a no. Instead, he explains all that has been happening. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. So after answering John's question in a very roundabout way, Jesus then decides to teach the crowds gathered around him not about himself, but rather about John, the one who had preached about Jesus in order to prepare the way for him, the one who baptized Jesus, the one now in prison, wondering if it had all been for nothing or if it really had been worth it. Had John's expectations been met? Jesus also asked the crowd about their own expectations. Had they expected John to be royalty or a prophet? Who did they expect John was preparing the way for, and why? That is what leads up to the section that we read for today. Jesus compares that generation that he's talking to children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another, "We played the flute for you and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not mourn." What we have here is an image of people not listening, not participating, not connecting with each other, and people who are being ignored, especially children. So Jesus is comparing the people to whom he is speaking with children. He talks about how they are confused by both John's and Jesus' actions. They said that John was not eating or drinking, and they said he had a demon. They said Jesus was eating and drinking, and so they claimed he was a glutton and a drunkard. Either way, you can't win with that. The people to whom Jesus is speaking weren't necessarily sure what to expect, and they now didn't know how to understand what they were experiencing. Maybe they wondered if Jesus was like the rebellious son in Deuteronomy 21, who was also called a glutton and a drunkard and was leading people astray. Even John, the one who had been preaching about Jesus, didn't completely understand, or he wouldn't have asked for clarification. And so they either had limited expectations or had expectations that were not being met. They were normal, ordinary people whose questions had gone unanswered and who had not necessarily been taught as well as they should have been or could have been. Not everyone would have had the time or ability to devote themselves to studying. And unlike today, when you can get all kinds of themed Bibles, the only access to Scripture then was the individual scrolls that were read in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And what was happening now with the appearance of Jesus was challenging and different. Jesus was showing them that God's love was breaking into the world in a new and different way. When John asked for proof from Jesus, if he was the one they were waiting for, Jesus' response wasn't to list Bible proof texts, but rather what people were experiencing. He didn't give a yes or a no. He gave a way to enable John and the others listening to think for themselves and to wonder and contemplate. I love this slide from Star Wars. Truly wonderful, the mind of a child is. Because when I see Jesus comparing that generation to children, I think it's because children do wonder and observe a lot. They see what's going on around them, and they ask a lot of questions. But sometimes we don't pay attention to them. We're busy, we're on our phones, we ignore their questions and their thoughts that they have. And being ignored is not a great feeling. We all know that because we've all been ignored, and we do it anyway. And we've probably also all been ignored, even in church. I know that in the past, I've tried to have conversations with pastors who have not welcomed my questions. And that's why I'm glad for Robert's upcoming series that he's going to address questions that you have. And I hope you'll submit some really good ones, because it's a chance that not a lot of people have, because there are churches that don't welcome questions, especially hard ones. And so after Jesus compares them to children, he then thanks his Father precisely for letting the children in on what is happening. He says it's been hidden from the wise and intelligent, the ones who really should know what's going on. The people who were ignored, not worthy, didn't understand, but had a desire to be listened to and heard were the ones to whom Jesus was revealed, not the people who were supposed to know and have all the answers already. That's really hard to hear, especially for me, because I'm someone who likes to have the answers and be right about them. Just ask my husband. I told him I was going to do that. But in Jesus' example, it's not about having the right answers about the Messiah, but rather it was about how people were experiencing the kingdom. In church, a lot of times we want black and white answers. We have topical Bibles that tell us where to find verses about many different subjects, and we think if we just go to those verses, we'll have some magical answer to our problems or our questions. Or if we just do what the verses say, then life will be good and we'll avoid a lot of pain. But unfortunately, bad things and pain happen anyway, and reading the right Bible verse doesn't just make it disappear. None of us escape pain and burdens in life. And when we see different pictures on Facebook or read advice like God doesn't give you more than you can handle, or everything happens for a reason, we can feel like as if everything bad that happens is maybe our own fault because we don't pray enough or we don't believe hard enough. And that can add more burdens onto us. We might feel like we are supposed to know something that we actually don't, or that we're not heard when we ask the questions we have, or sometimes that we shouldn't ask questions because we're supposed to have great faith, and we're given the impression that asking questions is sometimes seen as an indicator of weak faith. We can end up feeling like the burdens of life and faith are solely our own fault. We can't fix them, and we can't always talk about them or ask about them. That makes for a weary and burden-filled life, and faith and church shouldn't be the cause of it, but sometimes it is. It can be weary and burdensome to know who, what, or how to follow when there are so many mixed messages. We see it in our culture when we are faced with ideas, choices, and sides to take, and it can feel as if the whole world is dizzying with as quickly as events happen and information is communicated about them. We see it in the church too. I've seen friends talk about how everything they need to do in order to work toward holiness because of what sinners they are. There's this message that is not necessarily on purpose, but is given to people that they will never be good enough. And to an extent, that's true. We know we all sin. But I've seen people that seem so weighed down by the burden of trying to work their way through the process of sanctification that I have wondered if they really have experienced the grace that they talk about. For all of their posts about blessings and grace, there seems to be almost an underlying despair due to the constant focus on either how awful and undeserving they are, or maybe they're not truly deeply believing that their sin actually is forgiven and that God's grace is really all-encompassing. The church can be great at getting people to accept grace, but then once they do, there are sometimes burdens of keeping it added on. A friend of mine put it this way. She said, "It's come as you are, but then jump into a mold and stay put." She's asked questions and has been in the minority opinion when controversial events happened at her church. She's had friends unfriend her on Facebook because of her thoughts and questions in Sunday school classes. And eventually she just quit going to Sunday school because everyone just stared at her as if she was a heretic. Talk about burdensome. We hear those words of Jesus about rest, and we yearn for it, but we don't know how to achieve it. What can we do to be able to let those burdens slide off and let us rest? And when we can't do it, we can then feel even worse and more burdened and more weary. It becomes a vicious cycle in which we are trapped. But Jesus' words call out to us. "Come to me, all you that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Come to me, he says. As I mentioned earlier, we are faced with a lot of different choices and a lot of different paths to follow. But Jesus says coming to him is the path to follow. Anyone who is weary and burdened. And when we do, he will give us rest. He says his yoke is easy and his burden's light. But what does that even mean? To the people to whom Jesus was talking, it could have meant different things. It could have meant the yoke put on oxen to keep them together and control and direct them. It could have meant the Torah, all the teachings and laws the people were required to follow. It could have meant a reference to the time of the kings of Israel when people asked Rehoboam about the yoke, the hard service that Solomon had put on the people, and then Rehoboam deliberately made the yoke heavier. It could have meant the yoke of the Assyrians on Israel that is referenced by the prophet Isaiah. It's actually great that there could be multiple meanings for this because it shows us that not everyone faces the same yoke and the same burdens. But as with the yoke of the oxen, our yokes too can be what guides and controls us. And if Jesus says that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, then whatever Jesus has to offer to guide us is not going to be heavy and burdensome. Earlier I'd mentioned my friend who felt like church offered the invitation to people to come as they are, but then to fit into the mold that the church created. That's a type of yoke the church can use, specific rules, either written or unwritten, that a church can make people conform to a specific belief system or way of living. Some churches make people sign membership covenants. It keeps people together, but at the same time, it can make them feel as if they can't deviate or ask questions. You can end up with a very homogeneous group of people, at least on the outside, who keep all of their questions and burdens of faith to themselves. Right before Jesus talks about taking on his yoke, he's not talking about behavior. He doesn't talk about rules to follow, and he doesn't talk about conforming to expectations. He doesn't talk about signing membership agreements. He talks about the relationship that he has to the Father. I like how my favorite Bible scholar, N.T. Wright, puts it. He says, as he announced God's kingdom and put God's powerful love to work in healing, forgiving, and bringing new life, he obviously realized that the other people he met, including the religious leaders, his own followers, and the ordinary people, didn't have the same awareness of his Father that he did. Jesus had come to know his Father the way a son does, not by studying books about him, but by living in his presence, listening for his voice, and learning from him as an apprentice does from a master, by watching and imitating. And he was now discovering that the wise and learned were getting nowhere, and that the little people, the poor, the sinners, the tax collectors, ordinary folk, were discovering more of God simply by following him, Jesus, than the learned specialists who declared that what he was doing didn't fit with their theories. And so that easy yoke and light burden of Jesus is simply to get to know the Father in the way that Jesus did, in order to see the world how Jesus saw it. It doesn't mean that following laws or learning is bad, because Jesus did those as well. But it's not just about that. It's about bringing about the kingdom. And in doing so by following Jesus, it sometimes might mean going against what others in the church think or expect. This chapter began with the signs of the kingdom, this new kingdom of God that was breaking into the world that would be competing with the kingdom of Rome. People would have to choose if they would be in allegiance to Jesus or allegiance to Rome, allegiance to their Messiah or to their government. We may have expectations of what faith is supposed to look like, but when we look around and see what is happening and what people are experiencing, what happens then? Do we get confused as John did, wondering if we are right in following or living for Jesus? We can admit that can happen. Do we need to stop getting in our heads so much for the right answers and the right Bible verses, and instead look around and see the kingdom continually breaking in? Some things that came to my mind that I've noticed since coming to this church are when we participate in blessings in a backpack, or Fortitude Canteen outreach, or when churches were passing out free water during the Friendship Festival recently. None of these are big, splashy events, but rather they are what help people in need in ways that can sometimes be overlooked. It's not Jesus that places heavy burdens upon us. It's other people and even ourselves. We may not even realize it because it's often not necessarily bad things that burden us. Earlier I had mentioned that one of the images of the yoke we find in the Bible was when Isaiah spoke about the yoke of the Assyrians on Israel. Later, Isaiah mentions it again, this time though, in a different way. This time, it is the yoke being lifted. This is from Isaiah 58, verses 6 through 10. Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house when you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from among you, the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. Sounds a lot like what Jesus was saying about the kingdom, doesn't it? This yoke that is easy and burden that is light that Jesus offers is a way of life that helps to bring about the kingdom. It's not knowing the answers, following the rules, or even about sermons that tell you step by step what to do. It's about getting to know God in the same way that Jesus did and following Jesus in that way of life. I know I have felt weary and burdened many times. Maybe you have too, and you've never been able to pinpoint why, especially if it's had to do with church or faith. You've thought, that couldn't really be the cause, could it? But if you're now realizing that yes, it is, it could be that, then I encourage you to think about it a little bit more. Submit your faith questions for the next sermon series, and take that step toward Jesus and the rest that he offers.